Hello and welcome to the Zer0 Books Archives. This is Adam from the Acid Horizon podcast, and today I'm joined by Zer0 Books author Jacob Blumenfeld to talk about his 2018 work, All Things Are Nothing to Me, The Unique Philosophy of Max Stirner. Jacob joins us here in the archives to discuss Stirner's work and its contemporary relevance to the struggle for autonomy today. Stirner was undoubtedly the most infamous of the Young Hegelians, and arguably one of the greatest influences in Marx and Engels' turn away from Ludwig Feuerbach and his contemplative materialism towards a new kind of historical materialism. Yet Stirner himself received a colossal 400-page critique from Marx in what became the largest part of the German ideology, after which Stirner seems to have faded into semi-irrelevance and almost ridicule amongst the main currents of leftist thought. However, in All Things Are Nothing to Me, Jacob nonetheless sees the spectre of Stirner hanging over our contemporary age, and he brings it to us anew. So let's quote the book here. Stirner's anti-moral, anti-political, and anti-social philosophy is especially in vogue today. In a hyper-polarized, post-crisis world where God, government, and the good have all died, replaced by technology, markets, and private interest, Stirner's egoistic philosophy at first seemed compatible with this neoliberal nightmare, and surely enough, his once-sketched face has been revived as a meme, popping up in the stranger corners of the internet, as one of the first trolls to ridicule everything sacred in modern life, to praise the transgression of all social norms, values, and customs. Stirner may even be seen as a harbinger of today's edgy alt-right, but that is just one of many Stirners, a rather superficial one at best. What I hope to show is another Stirner, contemporary, critical, useful. So just before we go into this, just a little bit of background for the listeners, because this is my first Zer0 Books episode. As someone who's been writing on and researching the work of Max Stirner for about 4 years ago, since first picking up Stirner's main book, The Unique and Its Property, I eventually started it undergrad, then I made it in the focus of my PhD later. Jacob's work here has been an incredible resource for me, and I hope after today's talk you'll sort of feel the Stirnerian spectre sort of calling you to make this text your own, both in ideology critique as well in the practical elements of an insurgent form of self-ownership. But anyway, Jacob, welcome to the Zer0 Books Archives.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here.
So who really was Max Stirner? Sort of why is he such a minor figure in the history of leftist thought? Why don't we hear his name as much? He's getting a kind of revival now, but why has he been so ignored, suppressed? And I'm sort of wondering how we could feed this into sort of why you felt the need to write this book at the sort of the turn of the mid-2010s or so, because Stirner's book wasn't even translated for the second time when he was writing this. That came just after.
Max Stirner is a nobody, right? It's a literary creation. It's a fake name, right? It's a screen on which we project all our ideas of what is bad and wrong with civilization. So Stirner is the name of Johann Caspar Schmidt, who was who grew up in Bayreuth in northern Bavaria in Germany. And lived in the first half of the 19th century, around a time of industrialization and new revolutionary movements that were burgeoning, in which the French Revolution was still in the air, in which critiques of religion were really powerful, in which forms of capitalist labor were becoming more prevalent in the cities. It was a time of change, especially in Germany, which didn't really have a revolution yet, but it experienced the revolution through absorbing the news of France and England. Stirner grew up in this milieu and went to university like many other of his time, and listened to the lectures of Hegel, who we'll talk about maybe later. And got involved in a group of young scholars, young radicals who were devoted to taking these ideas from the lecture hall, these critical thoughts that were freed from kind of religious and moral dogmas, and turning them around against the political orders itself and against actually some of the critics themselves, to showing that we too are beholden to some of these dogmas and these ideas. So Stirner was part of this wave of, I would say, revolutionary, rebellious thinking, and he was just a particularly extreme case, right? In which he kind of solidified and crystallized the idea of critique against every kind of form of oppression, every kind of form of domination, every kind of form of dogma of what he called fixity possible. And so he's kind of an early template for the idea of what we call critique today, which really didn't exist. Critique criticism was just like an adjective for how you talk about other literature or something. Stirner really, and Marx and some others at that time, Bauer, were really developing this idea of critique, right? What does it mean to criticize? Stirner is forgotten, by many after his landmark book, the Uniqueness Property. It was a shocking book when it first appeared in 1844 because it criticized all the religious, political, and social dogmas of his time, especially amongst the left or the humanists or the socialists of that time. It caused a big splash, but then it was forgotten. He died. He died in poverty. He went to debtor's prison twice. He never had like a professional position. He was a tutor for a while. He tried to start a milk company in Berlin, where I live, which failed because he forgot to advertise it to customers. I mean, so he kind of died, and there wasn't really many people at his funeral. He's memorialized now by a sketch from Engels. That's how people remember him, and because of what other people said about him. However, he does appear, right? He does reappear like a ghost, right? Like a specter. He haunts kind of revolutionary thinking, revolutionary praxis. I mean, 50 years after he died in the late 1800s, he was rediscovered. That was the first great Stirner revival in the 1890s, really, when John Henry Mackay and some others started writing about him again. And when anarchists in the late 19th century started rediscovering his ideas as really powerful and taking them in ways that he maybe wouldn't have recognized. I mean, socialists were using him, unionists were using him, illegalists were using him. There wasn't like this one kind of Stirnerist influence that was kind of really broad and underground, right? And it developed in newspapers, especially in Germany. Some of the first gay newspapers in the world were influenced by
Stirner. The Eigene, yeah.
Eigene, yeah. And so many things. So Stirner kind of reappeared as an undercurrent in revolutionary thinking that was inspired by the idea of criticizing, the idea of insurrection. And then he disappears again, right? Disappears again, and gets kind of forgotten once more with the decline of kind of the classic anarchist movement and anarchist period, and reemerges again 50 years later in kind of 68 and the 60s, right? So every 50 years, he kind of dies and reappears. It's kind of like this ghost of Stirner past coming and going. So in the 60s, he gets brought back again as a harbinger of the wave of revolution, of like sexual liberation, of liberation against the state, especially, right? Forgotten again, of course, in the 70s, and reappears once again now. So 50 years later, what makes these moments similar? I mean, it's a good question. I think sometimes when our conditions produce the need for ways of criticizing our norms and our dogmas, Stirner is kind of brought back as a way of thinking through and challenging our what we take as common sense, what we take as liberatory might be itself kind of chains.
He's always brought back and appropriated really in the context of the time in which he's being reinterpreted. I mean, just thinking about the 60s, 68, I mean, that's when we get the first English language book on Stirner come out. R.W.K. Patterson's Nihilistic Egoist, the full nihilist sort of hog of Stirner at his darkest. We get in the sort of 10s, 20s of the English feminist movement, you get Dora Marsden. And then today we have revival of Stirner in a sort of post-structuralist, neo-anarchist, post-anarchist, I guess, turn. I think with this process of transformation also comes a lot of myths. I think we can get into Stirner, sort of his key concepts or his key ruminations, I guess, if he doesn't want to conceptualize them too much, by thinking about some of these myths. And I think the first one I think should clear out the way is the notion of egoism in relation to an idea of the ego. Because it's a mistranslation, isn't it, fundamentally?
It's a poetic it's a creative translation, you could say. I mean, das Ich is just, the I, Ich is just a pronoun, right, for I. And it can be translated in different ways. I mean, you could use people kind of retrospectively can use the psychological term ego to project that back onto Stirner as if he was talking about kind of the same things that we understand by the word ego. But I don't think it makes sense, really. The way the term ego, which is kind of the first translation of Stirner's book, has come to be understood, it's just too much of an obstacle to really thinking what Stirner was talking about. Stirner wasn't talking about some kind of self-consciousness, aware of itself, or struggling with its external world through its understanding of its identity. His idea of an I, of das Ich, is a much more negative concept, right? It's a much more negative idea. So maybe just to back up a bit, Stirner talks about egoism, though, right? He does use the word egoistic, right? He used the word egoism. Why? And what do I do when I'm in my book to try to kind of demystify that? Well, usually when we think of the word egoism today, we think of, selfish individuals, materialistic individuals who don't care about other people, who who are self-interested, could be rational maximizers, right? And economic agents, you could say, are selfish agents who have no cares for other people. And that's it, right? No morals, amoral, right? And we think of that as actually kind of consistent with our economic practices of today, right? That's a capitalist egoism, right? So that's the egoism of the consumer, in a sense, or the one who adapts to everything around them. It's what capitalism produces, what Marx says, the icy cold cash nexus that dissolves all moral bounds is the egoism of money, I think Marx describes it as. Stirner's talking about something different, right? Stirner's talking about a whole other idea. So what Stirner's really responding to is moral thinkers, politicians, newspaper articles, people who are defending kind of the bourgeois family and other kind of institutions and saying, listen, you, this citizen of Prussia, the citizen of Germany, citizen of whatever you are, you should act for the good. You should act for this state. You should act for this cause because that's what makes you a better person. That's what makes you a better human. That's what makes you free. So act for the good, act for the just, act for truth, act for the king, act for God, act for state, right? And if you don't do that, you're an egoist. So egoism was really kind of this idea of it was the boogeyman against kind of the moral order. It was seen as that which, denies the altruistic individual who sacrifices for the good of the state and the society and the kingdom and the church. Stirner just obviously said, no, that's just bullshit, right? All these terms, all these universal terms are hiding particular ideas under them. They're hiding particular forms of subjugation. When people talk about acting for the good, they mean a particular kind of good that can adapt you to a kind of a hierarchical state or something. Talk about being truthful. They don't mean being truthful about kind of the economy, really. They mean being truthful in terms of representing the truth of the king or the truth of society. What Stirner wanted to do is say, all these kind of universal abstractions are actually kind of the forms of ideology. I mean, that's kind of our term we could use, the forms of ideology, and we could really polemically, why not just defend the term egoism against that and say, what about acting for ourselves? What does it mean to act for ourselves? To care for ourselves without acting for this kind of pseudo-universalistic concept that's imposed on us from birth to adapt to a kind of normative conception of this society. So he reclaims this idea of egoism in a sense as a polemical tool against this form of, I would say, dominating adaptation, and says this is what we are. This is what we should be. We should be egoists. Sure, call us egoists. I don't care. It's like reclaiming a word. Just like people get insulted all the time and reclaim that word for themselves. You could think of the word queer, for instance, that starts with an insult and then gets reclaimed and says, fuck it, we are. I mean, there's other terms like that in history. And I think Stirner was doing something like that with egoism and trying to reverse the polarity of it and saying, no, why not take it back for ourselves?
I mean, I absolutely agree. I mean, I was just thinking about, so my latest chapter is on Feuerbach and Bauer sort of building up into Stirner. And Feuerbach's philosophy, just for everyone, is essentially the essence of God is simply the essence of humankind as a universal species. The human species essence is God, and we should actually rename Christianity sort of humanism. We should worship that and organize ourselves around that and strive to be the perfect human in our own lives, even though we can't necessarily get there. We should always be compelled to strive in that direction. In this first part of the Feuerbach's book, The Essence of Christianity, Feuerbach says, well, only God can be an egoist. And then immediately in Stirner's first part of his book, All Things Nothing to Me, this is the name of the first part of Stirner's book, of course, not Jacob's. He says, well, God's an egoist. Why can't I be an egoist? If we're replacing God, if we're doing away with the judgment of God, why is only God allowed to look out for his own? Why do I have to follow this universal, this essence of human self-interest? Even if this isn't religious, you should be a good human, a good worker, a good member of your state, a good member of the fatherland, etc., etc. The egoistic notion isn't about treating yourself in your heart of hearts of your essence, but it's rejecting all essentialisms of the self. I think that's where we get to the notion of, or if you can call it a notion, the non-concept of der Einzige, which is like pure non-identity. It's this little circuit breaker you can invoke whenever you get too tied up in these ideas about yourself as, a good German, a good Christian, and then you can say, well, actually, no, none of those things fully captures me, because there's always that immediate possibility of doing otherwise. It's like the cat about to push over the glass of water from the table. That's the Einzige coming through. You can just whack it off.
Yeah. That's a nice way of putting it. I mean, I think it's for Stirner, he doesn't want to be captured in predicates, right? Captured by an identity. I think this is what really speaks to us today, in a sense, the idea that we all have identities. We all have predicates that identify us, and predicates that are usually what we move through life. whether based on nationality, our race, our gender, or our beliefs, or something predicate of I am this, I am that. And Stirner already in the 1840s was challenging this idea that we are identified by our predicates alone, by our identities alone. And he was trying to call into question, where do these identities and predicates come from that we think are natural, we think are internal to us. We are more than that, right? We are more than that. We're always able to consume them, to dissolve them, become something else. And we're also less than that, right? We never fulfill those criteria itself. And so the question is, like, today, do we still call that egoism? I mean, that's up to us, right? I don't think we have to. We can if you want. We could use other words to describe that process. But like the word doesn't matter to me, right? It's the practice that matters. It's this notion of this kind of undoing of self-identification that Stirner grasps and is still kind of relevant even more so today than then.
We have never left that one bar on Friedrichstrasse, Hippel's Weinstube, where Engels and Stirner and Feuerbach and I don't think Marx, but the Bauer brothers, they were all just battling it out. Hess. It seems like this discourse is still ultimately relevant. And I guess talking about moving into this notion of criticizing where Stirner talks about identity, given that Stirner is so often caricatured as this thinker of the me, the I, as a sort of neoliberal, all-consuming a force. I mean, one of the problems for the interpretation of Stirner is this notion of, the second part of the title of, the unique and its property, the property part, the Eigentum. And I was just wondering if we could get into what Stirner means by property in a way that tries to deconstruct this notion that he seems to be like, I just want what's mine, I want to be left alone, like a narco-capitalist or a libertarian kind of thing. He has been used for those purposes. I mean, some people called this book the billionaire's Bible, essentially. But I mean, I quite like the notion that you put in the book. So, you say Stirner thus interprets property as a form of squatting and justifies it. And it reminded me a bit, I mean, because there's been a lot of Dune hype recently of the quote from Paul Atreides Muad'Dib from Dune. He who can destroy a thing controls the thing. It's all about the space of occupying, having that force of sort of violating it, negating it. And that's what clarifies ownership, not a mediated, it's not like it's being given to you from up high by an essential being, substance, God, the state, human species, or so forth.
Yeah, I know. When I heard that line too, I immediately thought of Stirner, and I was like, yeah, that's the same idea there. I mean, so Stirner is not defending a system of like private property rights. That's just clear, right? He just doesn't care about that idea that like we need to have a system in which everyone can be in a private owner of their realm, and that those rights are protected by law, which are backed up by the state. I mean, that's what a conception of property as a right is. And if he doesn't believe in that conception of property, then he's talking about something else. And you just have to accept that, right? And he's really hostile to the concept of right, and right, which is the German word Recht, can also be law, right? This was kind of used in his time also to defend the state, to defend the powers. I mean, nowadays we could think about whether rights and laws have changed in the 20th century. We have this concept of social rights now, not just private rights. Rights that are won by the working class or won by people struggling from below to defend themselves against the state. I wonder how Stirner would interpret that conception of right. But at least before there was such a thing as social rights, where there was only kind of the private right of the private owner defending private property, backed up, of course, by the power of the state. Stirner's doing something else, right? He's saying, okay, what it really is property? Is it really this conception of law, or is it a form of power? Right? Is it a form of power and control over something? And how do you prove that power? Do you prove it by using it? He's like, no, other people can use it. The way you prove ownership of something in terms of like a realist theory is by the ability to let go of it, to destroy it, to alienate it, to not use it, right? Because that proves this non-dependency on it, that you have the power to reject it, proves your domination over the thing itself. I think Stirner has that kind of theory of property in the background, or if we can call it a theory, kind of what I'm trying to interpret out of it. That's what I see makes the most sense. And he's saying, given this idea, who are those that own the wealth of societies? Well, those who have the power to control, to destroy it, the ones who can waste it if they want, right? They can use their wealth and just waste it whenever they want. They don't care about the needs of society. And therefore, since their power wasn't actually acquired through law, it's acquired through mostly, theft, primitive accumulation, or other forms of colonial plunder or exploitation in the workplace, which Stirner talks about, why can't we take it back? Right? Why can't we take it back? What's stopping us from taking it back? It's not against the logic of property to reclaim that for ourselves. In fact, that is the logic of property, right? And we call that squatting in English today. But you can just call that appropriation or expropriation in the sense of taking something for yourself and showing your power over it without, and here's Stirner's trick, right? Without becoming fixated to it, without it becoming a new form of domination over you, right? So that's one part of the property aspect. Just one other point is that property also has a different meaning in Germany. I mean, also in English, right? So there's not just property as a relation to something that we own or not own. There's also the properties of a thing. The property of this apple is that is red or something, or the property. Some of my properties, can be tall or something, right? It's quality is another translation. Stirner's also talking about those properties, right? What kind of properties define us? What kind of properties do we have, and how can we own them in his terminology, right? How can we make them our own? These things that are given to us, like we're born into biologically or socially, they're not our own. How can we appropriate them? How can we take control of it? So I think he uses this kind of idea of property in both ways, as like quality and as like kind of as kind of the relationship to external things, and tries to show both can be kind of reconsidered as and owned by us, not in the sense of owned, but through purchase and through money, but owned in the sense what we talk about sometimes, common sense, like own up to this, or you should own your actions, right? What does that mean? Own your, and I think that's where he's going at.
There's definitely as well, I think, very much an ethical and a spatial component to the notion of property too. So I was thinking of Eigentum and this notion of the Tum. There's a spatial aspect. When we translate Feuerbach's book, Das Wesen des Christentums, as the essence of Christianity, this Tums, it's Christendom. And there's like a spatial aspect there as the unique and its property, the Einzige und sein Eigentum, is the unique and its relation to the space of which it practices its own self-ownership. And I think you really bring this out well in the book. There's a great pun in one of the subtitles, Stirner, Practical Philosophy. Stirner has an ethical disposition towards its property. There is a sense of violations, of crossing a threshold in violating a fixed idea such that its fixity is rendered inoperative by the very fact that you can transgress it. But at the same time, it's not so much, it's violation, but it's not violent necessarily in that sense. I mean, there are definitely examples of violence in Stirner, of course, where talking about consuming other people, it gets very carnivorous there. Or he says the workers have the greatest power in their hands, all they need to do is seize it. Or one point he talks about scabbing, where someone says, look, we're asking you to pay us what we're due, and if you find anyone else to come in for less, then they will no longer be coming in. There is a great amount of insurgent workers' violence there, but it's always for the sake of self-ownership. I guess we'll get onto this later with the notion of the union of egoists. But I guess before we go into that, I want to talk maybe about one of the obstructions of this kind of notion of property, in which the property comes to own us. Because, I mean, Stirner can put forward all these amazing emancipatory ideas about property. For example, he doesn't really seem to have much of an opinion about debt. But as we know from his time in debtor's prison, he may not have believed in debt, but debt did believe in him. And people believed in debt. And that sort of social, ideological, materially backed force was able to still enclose him. So thinking about these fixed ideas, I was just wanting to ask sort of how we would explain the notion of the most famous thing about Stirner, the spook, the phantasm, as it has been translated now.
Just one more thing on what you were just talking about, and kind of like the spatial nature of property, and the word in German, Eigentum, Christentum. You could think of it like Christendom. The end of Christendom, like the dumb of Christendom, you could think of it as like domain, something with property. Like an Eigentum, it's like your own domain. That's a way of thinking about it. So it's the unique and their domain, right? And their own domain. And the domain, you could say, is like a spatial concept, but the unique is, I think, more of like a temporal concept. It's what passes through time and consumes experiences, right, through time in a sense. And the domain is kind of the spatial, the container in which that occurs. So I think so. There's another way of reading the uniqueness of property, also through this like spatial temporal lens, if you want to go that way. Yeah. There's some hints in Stirner for that, but you got to really draw that out.
That is deliciously Hegelian. I'm just going to say that it's definitely the first part of philosophy of nature.
I definitely read it through Hegel, of course. So on the spook idea, right? This is kind of what's been kept up in kind of the public consciousness of Stirner, of like, he just talks about spooks. Everything is a spook. A spook is just things that are like illusions, right? They're just illusions that we see around us in the popular reading of Stirner, in a sense, in the memeology of Stirner. But Stirner's having fun with us. He's a literary writer. He's trying to create. He's using a lot of puns in terms of his language in German. And he's trying to capture, our being possessed, right? The word possession can mean like we possess something, we own it, we hold it, but also we can be possessed, right? We can be possessed by ideas, we can be possessed by spirits. And he's trying to get on this like dual meaning of possession. And he thinks that sometimes the ideas we have that we possess can possess us. Right? We can also be possessed by the ideas we have, and we can be possessed by them when we tend to forget their origins, which are ourselves, and we see them as independent powers hostile to us, controlling us and dominating us. So I use the language of alienation and reification to explain this in Stirner. Stirner's like doing a really early form of this, also at the same time as Marx. Both are inspired by Hegel and Feuerbach, who does kind of the first kind of theories of alienation. They're all post-Feuerbachian thinkers in a sense. So Stirner is thinking through what happens when ideas that we have, not just I, but like ideas of a society, of a collectivity, start to separate those ideas from ourselves and lose track of where they come from, the good or the just or true. They become alien to ourselves, an alien power, and become fixed in forms of practice that tend to act upon us independently as they get reified and fixed. And you could think of, the economy itself as kind of as a structure which we think acts upon us, and yet though we produce it ourselves. Or the state, as something we think, determines our lives, and yet is nothing but the co-creation of our activities together, reflected back on us, determining us. Now, you could read Stirner in like an idealist way here and saying, okay, he's just talking about ideas. And the ideas have lost track. We've lost track of our ideas. And if we just remember, oh my God, there are ideas. Then like debt. Oh wait, debt. We just created the idea of debt. Let's just like uncreate it with our thinking. And then the debt will go away. That's what Marx's and Engels' critique of Stirner was. Obviously, Stirner is not that stupid. He knows that ideas have material presence. They have a material force. And they're embedded in societies. And even after the material force kind of goes away, the ideas can last. So we could still be enthralled to certain conceptions, even though they have no practical force over us. So Stirner's really getting at a more complex relationship between ideas and matter than kind of a crude determinism. He's trying to get up, like, how are we enthralled, possessed by conceptions, by forms of life, what Marx calls real abstractions, which shape our activity, embodied in institutions and practices that we have lost track of as our own. I mean, this is like a classic theory of alienation, right? And our power to reclaim that is not just a power of ideas, although that's part of it. It's also social power, and that's where the union of egos comes in, or the union of eyes. And but part of it is this rethinking, and part of it's this practice part. And you talked about like kind of the ethical relation to Stirner, and I think that's key, right? It's not just a thinking; it's a practical orientation to life, as oneself and with others, right? He's never against other people, ever. As kind of, other people are also part of our joy, part of our force, part of our life.
Yeah.
He's against being dominated by any conception of something outside of you, right? So I love them all, right? What he has this line like, everything is owned by one person, everything is owned by everyone. What's the difference? Like, like I and I, we are all together, like I and I, and we can come together in different ways and come apart in different ways. This is part of our practice, our practical relation to each other. That's what I call it ethical, right? Stirner, probably wouldn't, but I think that the way we can think of ethics and not morality, if we distinguish the two, maybe we can think of him as an ethical thinker in the way Deleuze talks about, or Hegel talks about, ethical life.
Morality is, if you consider morality in the sense of laws, codes, principles, and ethics in the sense of orientation, which doesn't have any structuring sort of, maxims, you must do X, Y. Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. I mean, Saul Newman's work on this has been absolutely fantastic, for example, on Stirner as an ethical thinker.
I think he is. I think it makes sense to read in that way. I also try to trace Stirner, back to the Stoics a bit. Not in the kind of the modern sense of a Stoic, it was like a non-emotional person, but the Stoics is kind of this kind of school of thought which was really trying to have a practical orientation to life, which Foucault picks up upon in his lectures on the hermeneutics of the subject. So Stirner has this kind of way of practical thinking, I think, and we should read Stirner as a practical thinker, and not as kind of just trying to conjure away bad ideas in our heads.
Absolutely, and he was very engaged. I mean, this book was written around 1843, but published around 1844. they had to change the date on the publisher because of the police censorship. But this book was considered too absurd to be dangerous, so they let it back out. But he was very active in the revolutionary circles of his time, at least in the theoretical sense. And he was debating with, I mean, he had a big critique of the socialists of his day. It's not so much anti-socialism so much as he says he's going against the idea of sacred socialism and against the idea of thinkers such as Moses Hess, who was one of the big socialist thinkers at the time, very influential on Marx and vice versa. And then Hess was eventually, in a way, became very much more influenced by Marx. He was actually one of Marx's representatives at one point to some workers' congresses. And his critique of socialism seems to be the main rhetorical flourish that appears throughout the entire book. The freedom of X is not my freedom. The idea that Feuerbachian humanists want to reorient society around the human species. What does that say to me? I'm not the human species. The socialists want to make society the rule of everything. I mean, Moses Hess puts this quite clearly in his text like a communist credo. I'm not society. If society owned everything, I own nothing. Bauer wants to say the critic should be the one prodding all of society into its proper self-consciousness. He says, well, if criticism is above everything else, then what pleasure can I take from critique? I mean, going into this critique of the socialists, I just wanted to think about this elementary rhetorical move and think about how it talks about how Stirner's practical aspects will come forward in the debate versus revolution versus insurrection. In some sense, he's a non-revolutionary thinker, but it's not in the sense of dampening that radicalism, but trying to preclude the ways in which this radicalism meets its own children, sort of the Robespierre thing. I mean, he was seeing it with Bruno Bauer, he's most known for his awful anti-Semitic tract on the Jewish question, which Marx famously responded to, but he was also known as a Robespierre of theology. And he was a very French revolutionary thinker. He wrote this amazing The Trumpet of the Last Judgment against Hegel, the atheist and Antichrist, where he talked about Hegel making everything French and cutting off the heads, dissolving Christianity. But Stirner's great response to this was, you're just replacing one thing with another. And it seems like a very trite critique, but it's one that has always come back. And I wonder if we can sort of go into this critique of the pre-Marxian, at least, socialists, the communards of his time in sort of the pre-1848 revolutionary period. I mean, this rhetoric obviously holds up. I mean, as anyone who lives in a Western constitutional democracy would know, but getting into that sort of his debate with the socialists and the liberals and sort of how that will feed into the idea of insurrection versus revolution. Or maybe it's not even a disjunction here.
No, I think you really nailed it on the head there. With Stirner does have this kind of way, this similar form of critique itself. What is the political freedom? What is the freedom of the states? The state's freedom, right? Or what is the freedom of the religion? It's like it's the religion's freedom, right? It's not my freedom. And I think it's really just captures something like, it's so simple and yet so clear in terms of trying to really grasp at what are these movements and what are these claims to freedom really about? Are they about liberating individuals from the forms of domination or the forms of control that determine their lives? Or are they about giving a new form of domination and a new kind of representative body that this time will truly be able to represent you, the laws or something like that? And actually, after the experience of the 20th century with so many perverted regimes, right, that tend to speak in the name of the people or revolutionaries, I mean, Stirner's critique just holds up, right? And just a question of like, who is the new master that's speaking now? Just such a clear way of cutting through the crap that gets spoken in your name. It's not a kind of abdication and a quietism or a reactionary position, right? Although he has positions on reaction, we can talk about. It's not a reactionary position, right? Because it's not like a defense of the status quo. It's just also, on the edge of this kind of this critical scene, just being aware of the forms of authority that get replaced. It's kind of a classic move. Also, like in the 20th century I would say I put it in the lineage of the Frankfurt School, kind of the critiques of authoritarianism of the 20th century, of Guy Debord, his ideas of spectacle, the anarchist tradition and the theories of authority. Also, like in very heterodox socialist traditions, it's also there. So Stirner's conception was of his critique of the socialists, right? The pre-Marxian socialists, and he's not really talking about working class, working movements, working revolts. He defends working revolts. He's talking about kind of intellectuals who are basing their conceptions of socialism on religious ideas of a brotherhood of man, religious conceptions of harmony, and that are the harmony of labor, right? Wilhelm Weitling is like a key figure here, who was who Marx displaced to write the Communist Manifesto. And Stirner's talking about these people, right? These these philanthropists of the working class, these people these NGOs of their time, maybe, I don't know, or these socialists who tend to think that all we need to do is now replace our capital, or replace our owners, right, of factories with the new owners of factories, right? This one is a representative of the workers. So the content of labor won't change, perhaps, but now you have like a new owner, and this owner is now a worker, right, or something like that. And Stirner was like, okay, this idea, and this idea is just nonsense, right? You need to have more than just a change of owners, right? You need to change what ownership is. You need to change the concept of ownership. You need to do it for also don't do it for some ideal of like mankind, of a human being, which is just kind of a vessel for ideology, for like whatever particular interest you might have. He thinks start with your needs, with your material basic needs, with what do you need, and not just, I mean, your material needs, but also your spiritual needs, and spiritual in kind of the broad sense of kind of intellectual, social, aesthetic needs. And I think that's kind of what Stirner's getting at, right? That's the I, the Einzige. That's where we should start, and that's what also I think Marx Engels really picked up on. After he read Stirner, he's like, we can't think of communism as an ideal that people should just strive for as like a good. We need to think about it from their individual needs, from the needs of people. What do they need, to be themselves, to be fulfilled? And that's what Stirner's getting there in this critique of kind of these utopian socialists of his day, and a critique that I think has held up. And this kind of, these socialists or the liberals and the humanists of his time, they're still kind of figures of that ideology today, and that way today. And we should kind of keep Stirner's method of critique alive, and trying to bring it back to like, who is speaking for, like who are you talking about? Which people? Which one? Who is going to be free? I'm going to be free. We're going to be free. And you could do this in kind of a, not a reactionary way, right, or a conservative way at all, right? It could also be like maybe not a revolutionary way, but a radical way. I mean, Stirner's relationship to revolution is very complex, like critical of kind of revolution as kind of a replacement of one state by another state. But he's definitely for, liberation of oneself from the state in a sense. And that is kind of a different conception of revolution, what he calls insurrection.
And I think maybe one of the terms, one of the terms I'm working with the Stirner stuff to help sort of clarify this is that Stirner, as you've said, he's not a fan of representation. He doesn't think you can be represented because nothing ultimately captures you, or something exceeds this or undermines this. And I think, people would be fine with an average representation, but overall, he's hostile to the notion of constitution. Substantialization of any social body that doesn't realize that it relies upon individuals to go back on. Hegel does this very well with his theory of the monarch, because it shows that someone can say no to the state and it's an arbitrary, pompous aristocrat. But Stirner wants to take that position onto himself. And this, I think, comes really clear in the distinction between insurrection, the German Empörung, and revolution, which is revolution is you aim at new arrangements, whereas insurrectionaries, they want to arrange themselves. And it seems almost a bit lifestylist, but I think if you think about it not in terms of a constituent power, where you have the people, capital T, capital P, the demos, found a new law that represents them. Rather, Stirner's doing what some thinkers, particularly the Italian autonomists, are calling, a destituent power. They will point at power and say, look, there's this inherent cut non-identity in power, which is never going to be reconciled. So let's just render this control, let's render it inoperative and see what we can do now. We've acknowledged that we will never be fully captured within it, and maybe that's a good thing. And I think the sort of social possibilities come about here is actually more democratic than what we think of as democracy, because democracy is all about the capital T, capital P people founding a new kind of representative law. But here it is just democratia. It's the people power. And this is where we get into the notion of the union of egoists. And I really love how you read this through Spinoza as the kind of a coming together of forced multiplication. I was wondering if you could sort of go into that a little bit more.
Yeah, just going off what you last said about, Stirner's kind of conception of insurrection and as opposed to revolution. And it's kind of, it starts with kind of a subjective, not just kind of an objective condition, but an subjective discontent, a subjective feeling or subjective conception of what's wrong, of being harmed, like in your dignity. But what Hegel also talks about in the Rabble, in the philosophy of right, this figure that's denied participation in society. They have this subjective kind of harm to their core, which emerges, through forms of uprising. And Stirner is also, I think, talking about this kind of form of subjective discontent that emerges in ways that cannot be captured in objective institutions or constitutions. Now that's not the end of the story though for Stirner, right? It's not like, okay, we're not arranged anymore in this like political order. Let's just, have fun. At that point, there's a conception of the union, right? Or that's one English translation. We also called it association. also called a club, or
What's the German? Sorry, is it Genossenheit?
no, it's Verein.
Oh, Verein.
Verein, which is usually today translated as club. Actually,
Mm.
it's a sports club is a Verein, or there's also union can be Verein, but it's more like a club. I mean, you should call it the club of egos. Actually, but I think of it also as commune and as association, right? And Verein also means association, also like means sports association today. And you could think of Stirner as kind of an associationist in a sense, or as like a commune, not a communist, but a communalist. I mean, communist in the sense of the commune is the
A communizer.
Communizer, exactly. That's where I go. The idea is that there are bodies, that there are forms of association that we can create and that we should create to manage our needs, to manage what we need to survive and to live and to thrive. And we have the power to create associations and secede from them, to let go of them, right? They're not kind of bodies that we are forced to submit to, that identify us permanently as members of this polity. There are forms of association that can, you can have association of people who are producing something, who are consuming something, who are sharing something, who are making something, who are doing whatever the fuck they want, right? You could create, there's no reason that you cannot experiment in all the ways in which you reproduce life. That's what Stirner's getting at, the kind of the experimentation of our social forms of existence. I mean, I was just looking at the new book from David Graeber and David Wengrow, The Dawn of Everything. And their whole thesis is about the great social experimentation that happened in indigenous societies before contact. And the kinds of social experimentation for thousands of years in prehistory were just wide and broad scaled. And it just reminded me of Stirner's conception of kind of this experimentation of life, this intercourse, which he calls it, this Verkehr, and this ability to come together and come apart again. And I use Spinoza to kind of talk about kind of formalizing the ontology of these associations, right? And the power that can come together. Stirner kind of doesn't really say it, what that is. Is it about a person? Is it about a couple people? I try to say that the individual that Stirner talks about can be conceived on Spinoza's lines as a composition of forces that produce effect through action. So therefore, on that level, an individual is not restricted to a body, to a singular body, right? An individual can be a collection of bodies that act together to produce a certain effect. It can be a union, can be an individual. And I think even Stirner says something like that, it's like it's a multiplier of force. And I think that way of, and Spinoza also has this like theory of joy and knowledge as a form of joy. I'm not sure if Stirner read Spinoza. I mean, it doesn't really matter to me, right? It's my way of putting them together. And I think there's kind of there's a collision of forces and thoughts there that produce new ways of seeing Stirner and giving it more relevance and more consistency or more coherence to it. And that's the way I like reading Stirner, and I like reading philosophy in itself, of trying to bring these ideas together and show actually you can really do something here. And Spinoza has a lot of kind of difficult abstract terms, but when you bring them together with other thinkers, they really take on a life of their own.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think Spinoza's theory of affect could be amazing for going over that. I mean, I'm going more Hegel route, but I think I'm going to have to go into Stirner at some point. Stirner. I'm saying it right, Spinoza at some point. But I just wanted to sort of anticipate a potential objection if the listener's thinking about this union of egoists, this free people coming together kind of thing, and thinking, isn't that the free market? No, because the free market is based on debt. It's based on people have to sell their labor because they have to respect property rights, and they don't feel like they don't have the ability to transgress that and really take what they need. There's a whole compelling force of police, state, military, ideology. And in that sense, I mean, I think you reference it at one point in the book, Jean-Luc Nancy, the inoperative community, thinking about how use union of egoists is not a community, because thinking about the roots of community, the com part, together, but the munus is a word for debt. The union of egoists is not based on debt. It's based on the expression of affect and multiplication of powers. In order for the union of egoists to come about, any space that they occupy, and it is a spatial thing for Stirner, would have to render inoperative the very operations and mechanisms of debt in any area it squats in. And Stirner, his critique of society is based on the German word Gesellschaft and its root in Saal, for the term for a hall. It's like, no, a Gesellschaft, a community, is a hall that holds all of us in common. A mutuality, a Genossenheit, or we can translate it as a comradeship, is one in which we hold it in common. We hold it, it doesn't hold us. And I think this is a really great way of responding to some of these objections, which obviously at the time I think maybe this doesn't work for the historical Stirner. I think you can appropriate him. He doesn't have to be a fixed idea himself. I don't really want to translate the French term for what Deleuze does to philosophers, but gives them a monstrous child, so to speak. I mean, because Stirner himself, he translated he translated 2 economic textbooks in his time into German, most notably
Adam Smith,
Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations,
and Say.
Marx read it. Marx may have read it. I mean, I think let's just build on to the building question of, which is one of the things I think I'm deferring even my own thesis going about 2 years down the line now, the Marx-Stirner confrontation. I mean, I think given Marx and Engels' formulation of the proletariat as I am nothing and yet I should be everything, I think this really fits in with Stirner's Die Einzige. And you say the same, and you sort of say that for Stirner's almost like doing a Marxian communism from the first person perspective, even before Marx has fully articulated it. Even when Stirner would be one of those things that pushes Marx into that more materialist, less idealist, less contemplative domain.
Yeah, I really liked what you said about debt also in your conception of Stirner, and I hope you kind of work on that and develop that idea of debt and the spatial theory of Stirner and these concepts. Maybe even look into what is Stirner's relationship to Smith and some of these other ideas at the time, and don't give up the Hegel. Just
oh no, don't worry, I'm never giving up on Hegel.
But back to the question. So one thing I say in the book, which is probably one of the most provocative claims, is I guess Stirner's egoism is Marxist communism seen from the first person singular perspective. It's kind of a thesis statement of the final chapter, and it's very complicated, very 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 counterintuitive claim, which would fly in the face of any Marxist conception, right? Of communism is about collective solidarity, egoism is about is the definitional opposite of solidarity, right? It's not caring for others. So how can Stirner's egoism be Marxist communism? That's the trick. That's the trick you have to pull, which I started to figure out, which you have to finish it, Adam. And I'm not the only one to say this, right? So there's a history of thinking through Stirner from this kind of perspective. Already in Emma Goldman's time, people were writing about this in her newspaper, which I cite. There's like some people who thought about, I mean, Engels said it first, right? Or no, even before Engels, Feuerbach said it first. I mean, when he reviewed Stirner, and Stirner agreed. I mean, Stirner's saying, like you said, he's not against like socialism, against sacred socialism. He even says, all individuals are of course communists in the kind of the basic sense of their communal being. We're not pre-social beings, right? But we start off as completely social beings, and we have to figure out who we are out of that. We have to break through these ties. We have to break through these alienations, these forms of alien property to find out who we are. Those are forms of negation, subtraction, secession. There's really Hegelian terms of like negativity, which are identical to freedom in a sense, right? Become free. And Stirner, Stirner agrees with that kind of basic conception, but doesn't get fixed down in that. And then in the 70s, there was a famous kind of situ group called For Ourselves who wrote this awesome text called The Right to be Greedy, which also talks about like communism and egoism being two sides of the same coin. So I was trying to really think through that and what does that mean? And I think that one way to make sense of it is to say, when you talk about like kind of communism in Marxist sense, right? Especially the German ideology sense, in which is kind of this conception of something in which there's no powers outside of individuals anymore. That what there is in our power to influence, to affect as individuals together, right? Individual in the expansive, Spinoza sense, right? So we could come together as individuals to determine the fate of our lives and the structures that we live in, and that is the sense, and determine our needs. And Stirner is kind of, I think, saying that from like, what does it mean phenomenologically to go through life as if you could actually have the power to take care of your needs? That is impossible on your own. That's just like a fact. Like, no, you cannot take care of your needs on your own. You need other people. So the idea that like we need other people also, and other people need us to take care of themselves, I think is implicit in the idea of Stirner's egoism, if you want to call it that, or his conception of the union of I's. And that would be the first person kind of perspective shift. So instead of looking at it as like a social form, which Marx is doing, look at it from a first person perspective, but without being like a solipsist. Without being, blinded to what that implies and what that presupposes. But you should also not ignore it, right? So for Stirner, it means consume. Like he's got this language of consuming and dissolving. We could use other language, but relating to property of others and yourselves as part of the same that can be violated and dissolved. I mean, to me, these are forms of relating to other people that are joyful, that are satisfying to your needs materially, but also beyond that, and that can create structures that can also be changed and determined by ourselves. In which now you have no power over the market, right? You just have no power to control the prices of goods as an individual. You have no power to control the emissions of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. There's an ideology that you can through recycling or through some like individual consumption. But Stirner is saying, what would it mean like if that was in our power, to have that power over something? And that's not a free market perspective. That's the opposite, right? This is something in which we could, we don't need money, right? We don't need debt to do that. We need certain relations and experiences from ourselves that are joyful, right? And that are based on other value, other means, and other ends, and that also never forget that they're also about ourselves.
They are, and I think with especially taking like a dialectical perspective on Stirner's view of the self and the other are always interlinked. The otherness, negativity is always prescribed into you. It's not. I mean, his critique of the neoliberal market that was saying, become who you are, be the person. Where do you see yourself in 5 years' time? And then you ask that question 5 years later. He says, no, I'm always going to be inadequate to this identity, but that's because I already am that thing. I already am a human being. I already am a worker. I already am there's always a little, I'm always a little German or a little, it's critiquing that notion of always being called to something. It fundamentally undermines the kind of ways in which our identities are modulated. So rather than being simply disciplined, if we're going to go a bit Deleuze-Foucault here, into going to school, you are this, you are this, you are this. Modulation is the paths are left open. Your training never ends. Your education never ends. And it's saying, well, his earliest work, one of his earliest works, his first work was on school rules, which is a bit too young Stirner, not quite as rebellious, but he did a later one called On the False Principle of Our Education, where he talks about we're just made as creatures now. We haven't turned our knowledge, of our self-knowledge, into action. We need to be creators as well. And there's definitely a Hegelian lineage behind that. But of course, most of this Hegelian lineage is buried in parody. I mean, the first section of the book, which is where the most notorious parts of the book are in terms of Stirner's application of various racial categories, that's mainly a parody of the anthropology section of Hegel's philosophy of mind, which Hegel goes is most phenomenological, and according to Hegel's own advice, should have his skull cracked in for saying such things. I'm a young Hegelian in that sense. But even through this Hegelian parody, this interdepartmental beef, this arguments across this one table in a bar in Berlin, in Hippel's Weinstube, Stirner's still kind of hanging over us today, because it's not so much a sense of how can I get what I can out of this? How can I be a better self in the eyes of the law, the state, the market? But it's, okay, the freedom of today is not for my freedom. The freedom of the market is not my freedom. My freedom to work, as Marx clearly put it later on, is the freedom to sell my labor because I'm free of having anything else that could support me. And I think this does withstand the Marxian critique. I've identified a point, actually, in which Stirner appears in Capital Volume 1. So in the German ideology, his nickname for Stirner, Marx, is Sancho. And he says, Capital needs this Sancho Panza figure to undermine its own morality so it can rewrite its own rules. It needs this straw nihilist. Like, no, there couldn't be any laws at all here. This is a destitution of all of law. And that's, I think, Marx and Engels and Stirner can really be a productive way moving forward. I mean, or at least we can take back Engels from Karl. No. This is a really fantastic book on first-person Marxism. It really sort of articulates the history of it through Heidegger, Landauer, Nietzsche, Deleuze. It really sort of brings the whole kind of tradition together around this spectre, this nagging impulse, this gadfly of, well, this isn't my freedom. And I just want to ask any sort of final thoughts on sort of reflecting back on this book and its impact, and maybe sort of the future of any sort of Stirner studies, and of course, anything you want to plug for any particular projects you have right now.
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, the first draft of the book was actually written in 2009, I think, or 2008. It was a long time ago. And then I re-edited it, and I was just sat in my folders for like a decade. I didn't know what to do with it. And I re-edited it a couple years ago, like 2017 or something, and then published it. So it's been in my, I've worked with this a long time ago, and there's been, and I think since then there's been some new writings and new research, and I'm very excited to see what people do with it, like yourself and others. One of my favorite parts of the book that I wrote is the kind of the weirder stuff on like Landauer. I really liked looking at loose or header, like strange influences that Stirner has had on people, maybe subterranean current. And Landauer's like this Jewish mystic, also part of this Bavarian uprising in 1919 in Germany. One of the most amazing moments in European history, you could say, is the German Revolution, especially 1919, which is wild. What the fuck happened? I mean, if you ever want to look at something historically, 1919, Bavaria, Munich, April, it's just like artists, playwrights, anarchists just take over the city and just run it like for themselves for a while. It's wild. And Landauer was part of that. I mean, he was like the minister of education, and he would just go around reciting Whitman, to people when they would ask him to like do a policy. He's like, he would just like say poetry to this guy. But anyways, I really like, and Landauer was killed after that, of course, by the forces that were sent by the socialists. Fuck them. Anyways, so I hope in the future to kind of trace out some more strange influences that Stirner has had, and not kind of the traditional ones. I started working on an article about like the two magazines in Germany that took Stirner's like that were based on Stirner's name, like the Einzige und die Einige. There's two kind of magazines in the early 20th century Germany that were like avant-garde publications influenced by Stirnerist ideas, and I like to kind of discover those a bit more. They're not translated, translate some of the articles and why did kind of the avant-garde, the Dadaists, the new kind of a gay movement, also kind of Jewish revolutionaries, why do they take Stirner's ideas and translate them into their own ways, and what were they used for? So look out for that in the next couple of years. In the meantime, I do a lot of other work these days. I wrote a book on property in Kant, Fichte, and Hegel. It should be out in the next couple of years. I write articles for the Brooklyn Rail, sometimes on Utopia and other things. But my idea right now is I'm also working on a book on expropriation and the history and the concept of expropriation and what it means today, especially in Berlin, because there was actually a referendum to expropriate large landowners, which passed.
200,000 apartments or something?
200,000. And we'll see if it actually passes, if it's implemented. But so I'm interested in the concept of expropriation, socialization, and you can see the roots in Stirner in the background there. So that's where I'm kind of taking Stirner and having fun with it and running with it.
Oh, absolutely, mate. We need to re-Germanify the Stirnerian studies in the Anglophone world, because so far in the Anglophone world, we've mainly just got loads of great Italian writers on him. But
yeah, it's true.
We had to wait for Larry Stepelovic to translate most of the good Stirner stuff.
Yeah.
But just listeners, anyone thinking of going forward on the Stirner studies stuff, I'd recommend Larry Stepelovic's work on Stirner Marx. He's got a great book summarizing all these young Hegelians. It's not the most charitable to Marx, but Marx wasn't the most charitable to Stirner. Let's keep this generational feud going for another 100 years or so. As first person, but not third person Marxists. Tim Elmo Phaeton's done some great work on the Eigentum and sort of anarchy and neuroplasticity. Saul Newman's got the first edited collection of essays on Stirner, and that's got some of his actual pseudonistic written works in there. And I think if we're all done with that, we can say sort of, ich habe mein Sack auf nicht gestellt. And Jacob, thank you so much for coming on to the Zer0 Books Archives.
Vielen Dank, tschüss, das macht's gut. Wir können nächstes Mal mehr reden, bitte.